going to be taking a look at the swing of one of the young superstars on the PGA Tour, Collin Morikawa. This is a swing that I've gotten the opportunity to see up close many times, and his ball control is truly impressive. I think you will find Collin at the top of most of the ball striking categories. I know that his first 2 years on tour, he's been inside the top 10 on strokes gained approach, and he's truly one of the most impressive ball strikers on the tour. And what I find interesting about this swing, and I think it's important for our Course Kings members to understand, that he makes a lot of moves that I advocate against in my teaching. And the point of this video is to basically show his greatness and the moves that he matches up with certain moves that I do not teach, or I believe that makes it difficult for most amateurs to play from. So if we take a look, quickly down the line here, the thing that stands out to me, right away, I'll call attention to a couple of things. So the first thing you see is the hand path moving inward, and you see the club head staying gently outside of his hands. Now that's something you see myself and the other Course Kings instructors talk a lot about. We refer to it as managing the location of the center of mass of the club. And, it's a great move that you see him demonstrating here. And it's something that we really, really advocate, because it makes how that club moves in the backswing makes it either difficult or easier to shallow the club in transition. So let's first talk about a move that I'm not a big fan of. Collin does not rotate his pelvis very much, and he does not allow his knees to change flex very much. And that's obviously not a deal breaker when you're talking about an elite level player, but for the majority of golfers, it does make it more difficult to get rotation of the lower body, rotation of the upper body, and depth to the hand path. And most amateur golfers need depth. They need the club, they need the hand path moving back, up, and in this direction behind this right shoulder throughout the course of the backswing. So let's talk about the first matchup that exists in his swing. So because he's got this restricted lower body, you're going to still see him achieve depth by retracting his trail elbow and trail arm and moving it sort of back, behind, and around the rib cage here. So he's doing that by flexing his trail arm, retracting his right scapula, and internally rotating his trail shoulder. Now that internal rotation isn't necessarily a bad move. I'm fine with some of that in the backswing. Most amateur golfers do far too much of that, and the club gets very much up and across the line at the top. But Collin manages it pretty well because he adds another matchup. So let's talk about, again, let's recap this first matchup. Because he has very limited rotation of the lower body and does not change flex of his knees very much, the first matchup is he pulls the right arm back behind him and retracts that right scapula and internally rotates that shoulder. That's what allows him to get this beautiful depth that we see to the hand path here. Now, as we go on to the top of the backswing, we're going to start to see something here. You see the shaft starts to work vertically, but then all of a sudden, Collin manages that center of mass in a way to where if we just draw a straight line up through the butt of the club, you're going to see that he always manages that center of mass, and he keeps it basically on this side of his hands. So that's what I would consider sort of like a pre-shallowed position. And it's important for him to do that because he doesn't have a tremendous amount of depth to the golf club at the top of the backswing. And he did not have a lot of rotation of his pelvis early, which limited that depth. So he had to give himself a little bit of a head start in the backswing. Okay, he's in the classic, what I would consider overly flexed right arm position, and very, very retracted sort of right scapula. And when you look at this forearm bone here, this forearm bone gives you a great indication of how his shoulder is being rotated. So the more vertical that forearm bone is, the more externally rotated the shoulder is. And the more horizontal that forearm bone is, the more internally rotated that shoulder bone is. Now, internal rotation is something that you can see from a lot of good players. I typically see it from a lot of poor players, though. And where you generally see the club go at the top when you have an internally rotated shoulder would be similar to like Calvin Peete over here on the right. So you're going to see that same right arm flexion, retraction, internally rotated right shoulder, but you see the club is in a completely different position than where Collin has it. And so that leads me to talk about the next matchup. If you look at Calvin Peete over here, what you're going to see is a lot of extension in this lead wrist. And that's predominantly why you see it's lead wrist extension and lead forearm supination, which leads to that club's center of mass way over here across the line. Now, Calvin Peete made it work beautifully because he had an incredible pivot and he was able to get that center of mass to work back around behind him in transition. Now, there are not many amateur golfers that can do that. Thus is why I don't let many amateurs get in this position at the top. I get them more over here to where Collin is. Now let's talk about Collin's matchup. The differential between his move and Calvin Peete's move is in this left wrist. So Collin's way of managing this center of mass and keeping it basically over here on this side of the hands is to add a tremendous amount of left wrist flexion. So that would be sort of the second matchup that I would say exists in his swing. A bowed or an arched left wrist at the top with a slightly internally rotated and retracted trail shoulder. And so those two moves, I don't think his golf swing functions if he's missing one of those matchups, if it's either or. And so this is a great lesson for how you can blend pieces together. And I'd like to see far more amateurs coming to me with the type of wrist mechanics that Collin has if they're going to not turn their hips very much in the backswing. If they're going to retract the right arm and internally rotate it, it's almost mandatory that you have this type of wrist action. So the next matchup, or the last matchup that I really want to talk about here that makes this backswing work, is the fact that you see, a wrist alignment that looks kind of like this, and you see a club face that pretty much matches up beautifully with it. Now, again, you can't have one or the other. You got to kind of have all three of these things. And what he's doing is Collin has a very, very weak left-hand grip. That weak left-hand grip allows him to flex his wrist, keep the center of mass on the right side of his hands, and not have him dramatically closing the club face. As you know, he likes to play a fade pretty much exclusively, especially with the driver. So he's got the face just closed enough to start at left, but it's open enough to where he can have the face open relative to the path. So those are some incredible backswing matchups that I think we can all learn from. The beauty of his golf swing, even though he's doing things that I am a proponent against, especially with the lower body, I find a lot of value when I come across a swing of a player who does control their golf ball with a lot of precision. And so it's understanding these matchups and variables and how to put these things together that I think can help all of us as teachers and as players. So maybe you aren't as flexible as you once were. Maybe you can't quite turn the lower body as much as you used to. We've gotten up there in age. So what does that mean? That means it gives you the green light to go ahead and feel like you're kind of pulling that right arm behind you in an effort to get some depth to the butt of that club. And as you're doing that, maybe it's okay if you throw a little flexion in your left wrist to manage that center of mass and basically keep it on this side of your hands. And I think if you can do that, if you can manage the center of mass that way, and you have any type of a reasonable pivot, you're going to see the club kind of shallow out enough in transition to where you can hit high quality golf shots like you see Collin Morikawa doing over and over and over.